Welcome once again to the Georgetown Conversations. We have right now John Pang, who is a senior fellow at the Hannah Arendt Center at Bard College in New York. John and I go back a long way. I first met him at Stanford University, where he was studying. And then, we kept in touch. And then he came back to Malaysia as the director of CHARI, which is the CIMB ASEAN Research Institute. And from then onward, he moved to Singapore, to the National Technological University, where he was fellow for a while. And now he's in New York. And John is one of the super smart Malaysians who has thought a lot about social issues and political development, and also, geopolitical implications. Last year, we had a very good conversation on what was happening in Hong Kong. Why did the protests occur? What are the implications for both Hong Kong itself, China, Asia, and maybe the world? And of course, as you all know, this year, the protests in Hong Kong has spread worldwide, and it has now happened in the United States. So welcome, John. We'd like you very much to have a conversation on this subject, and perhaps you can give us your quick take on what's happening and how you look at the way the situation is unfolding.
Thank you for this opportunity, Andrew. This is, I've looked forward to this. This is going to be fun. I've always enjoyed our talks. And yeah, over the years, we've kept in touch. And that conversation about Hong Kong was I recall, really significant. As it happens, I then had to teach I then sort of got involved in teaching a course at Bard titled precisely Protest and Revolution in Hong Kong. I co-taught it with a colleague, but as the semester went on, we were actually supposed to collaborate with Hong Kong University in doing this. Actually, it was supposed to be jointly taught, but things got so heated in Hong Kong, so much disrupted, that on the other side, the university had to shut down and so on. But it's been, I'd like to reflect on teaching it and communicating the issue, and it's actually no straightforward thing, because I've had to look at it from a very US perspective. The view from here, and surrounded by the media discourse on this side. And there's a huge variation between, what is reported here. There's a huge difference between that and what people in Hong Kong might think, and most of all, what people in China, how that might be viewed in China, let alone in Southeast Asia. So I guess the first salient feature of the Hong Kong crisis, before we even delve into it, is the deeply contested nature of what exactly is going on. It's extremely difficult when you have this sort of mass movement, a leaderless movement, and it begins with at least middle of last year with a kind of mass movement of people, say 1 million people in the streets, right? A lot of people marching, and then sort of the thing gradually devolving into a smaller, more militant and protracted series of type of mobilization in the street, which is fairly kind of violent. The coverage in the West, of course, brings us to this perspective we have here, that it's also at the same time a geopolitical issue. There's no question at all. It's heavily geopoliticized. And the question of what exactly is going on is really, that's what's at stake, okay? So I have looked forward to talking to you about this, because you kind of know more about Hong Kong than I do, having worked there. But I want to, it's very, the usual kind of media discourse, and it's fairly important, because right now China is there's a strong diplomatic attempt by the US, right, and its allies to basically isolate China over the national security law issue. So as you're aware, Beijing decided at this recent conference to implement or to begin to draft the national security law. And this is said to, be the end of the one country, two systems, right? So it's not, the Hong Kong issue is by no means past. It is by no means merely on the street. It's very much at the heart now of this, or one of the key issues in this kind of contest between the US and China. So now we're trying to, today I'd like to get at those sides of the story that even in my class, I didn't get to talk about very much, right? And the parts that are neglected. The view that is to say, that is more from Asia, which is actually what we've been trying to do over the years. And hopefully, and I see with great excitement, you're going to be about to do with this series of discussions, to have a view from Asia, a narrative, a perspective from here, rather than be so completely submerged under a very particular type of weaponized media coverage, as we've seen over Hong Kong. So I want to get at the neglected perspectives. Yeah.
Good. I think you're quite right. The movement in Asia, well, the Hong Kong protests, I see this as part of a worldwide situation.
Yeah.
I think from my own perspective, the mass movement started with Taksin Square in
Tahrir Square, yeah.
Tahrir Square in the Arab Spring.
Exactly.
It was the first time that social media was used to great effect.
Yeah.
The way you can spread information, the way you can get the crowds in very, very fast.
Yes.
And it became kind of spontaneous, although there are also people who said that it was engineered. But whatever it is a bottom-up movement. And you're quite right. Hong Kong protests came from the fundamental inequalities in Hong Kong society. Hong Kong is one of the richest cities in the world. It's at the crossroads. Working in Hong Kong, for 16 years, it's very clear that it's very rich, and yet you have a huge underclass.
Yep.
And the people who are in the streets earning literally peanuts. Although the social welfare system is good, but accommodation is very, very problematic.
Yep.
You have people living in cages. That's the more extreme version. But
hasn't it been growing in the class as well?
It's because the last certainly since the last 8 to 10 years, the financial boom has caused property prices to escalate to such a degree that the young have actually almost no hope of getting accommodation.
Yep.
To buy their own homes.
Yep.
So the result was that even with controlled immigration from the north, from mainland China, the population, especially amongst the young, felt that they were increasingly hemmed in. Number one, they have difficulty buying homes. Number two, they have they're graduates from the local university, but their command of English is not as good as overseas graduates. The elite can afford to send their children to Oxford, Cambridge, Harvard, Stanford, etc. But the local universities, the standard of English is not that great. They don't speak very good Putonghua, and they understand the rule of law in Hong Kong. But the new influx of graduates from China are super duper in terms of drive, hunger for knowledge, ambition, and of course in the last 10 years, particularly last 10 years, although it started the tide started 20 years ago. In the last 10 years, increasingly mainland companies comprise the bulk of the financial activities in Hong Kong. Mm-hmm. Mainland companies moved into logistics, started buying real estate, and and into many spheres of life, such as being the major customers in the top supermarkets, and then going into the supermarkets also, not the department stores, but also the supermarkets, for example, buying powdered milk in Hong Kong. So to a large extent, there was increasingly this feeling of resentment. And then it came up to become a political movement at the grassroots level.
Right.
Which then, got sparked off because of the proposal to change the law, on the extradition issue. And the extradition issue is that you have a very strange situation in which Hong Kong, like any other, common law jurisdiction, should have its extradition laws. So Hong Kong has extradition laws with many countries, right? With Europe, for example, right? And I think, if not wrong, with America, but it doesn't have one with mainland China.
Yep.
And why the Hong Kong government introduced this law was because of a Hong Kong person who took his girlfriend, I think, to Taiwan, and then the allegations are she was murdered there, and the Taiwan government decided to extradite him back to Taiwan. And so the Hong Kong government thought this is a very good opportunity to introduce an extradition law, to have this law to enable Hong Kong people who have problems abroad to be extradited to their jurisdiction. But of course, the political movement was so sensitive that the people said this was all due to the backdoor channeling of extradition to China, to the mainland. Now, you must remember, Hong Kong operates in one country, two systems. It's actually within one country. So how is it possible that somebody in the mainland has a crime in Hong Kong, cannot be extradited to the mainland?
Absolutely.
This is a ludicrous loophole.
Yeah.
But there are many, and particularly after the anti-corruption campaign in mainland China since 2012, a lot of these guys who are wanted for corruption or allegations of corruption went to hide in Hong Kong and literally thumb their nose, at the authorities in China. So this was a sore point, even within the corporate and the criminal investigation agencies, put it this way. But this law then sparked a huge protest.
The extradition law. Yep.
Yeah, the extradition law.
Yes.
And that protest, became larger and larger until it was withdrawn,
yes.
as you know. So and then of course the protest got violent by the first attack on the Legislative Council, and then there were allegations of police brutality. And in many ways, you would see similar activities happening in the United States, that both sides accuse each other of brutality. You have vivid videos of anybody who disagrees get set on fire, get beaten up, and so Hong Kong society became extremely polarized because of this, right? So there's this faction that goes for law and order, who says that the police should do what they need to do, and there's the other which says that there should be a proper accountability on the police. And one of the fundamental problems in Hong Kong is that the legislature is so entrenched in its inability to deliver laws that reforms get stuck at the legislature level.
Right.
And part of it is due to the demands for political electoral freedom, etc., one man, one vote. But if there was a constitutional attempt to arrive at a settlement on this in 2013, 2014, but it failed. And then after that failed, everything went back. So there's very little capacity to arrive at compromises. One of the saddest part about the political scenery in Hong Kong is the inability to arrive at compromises.
Absolutely.
Politics all about compromises. But
Yes.
if you cannot compromise, you cannot agree, because both sides feel that each other are entrenched.
Right.
Then you end up with a standoff. And
Right.
that standoff, basically what has happened is that when under the one country, two systems, the Sino-British Declaration, which formed the basis for the handover of Hong Kong back to China in 1997, the understanding was that China, or at least Hong Kong legislature, would pass a national security law enabling mainland to set up the national security machinery in Hong Kong. This was refused, or not so much refused as the people objected to it early on, and then the matter got postponed. And now it's 23 years since 1997.
Yeah.
And because of the US-China, how shall I say, rivalry in geopolitical situation, the temperature certainly has gone up. During the protests last year, many people in Hong Kong, as well as mainland, accused of foreign interference, which is basically a kind of a code word. It's getting more and more clear now. People felt that Taiwanese and the Americans interfered in the Hong Kong protests. And therefore, the need for national security law became more urgent. And I think the legal specialists discovered that you could do this if Hong Kong legislature cannot pass the national security law, which is under Article 23 of the Basic Law.
Yes. Yes.
Then the mainland, which is the sovereign power, the Basic Law is subsidiary to the Constitution. One country, two system does not mean that one country, the Basic Law is at par with the Chinese Constitution. The Basic Law operates as a subsidiary law to the Chinese Constitution. And the Chinese Constitution is subject to interpretation by the Standing Committee within the Chinese legislature to interpret the law. And that interpretation came out that actually it is possible for China to pass a law, and then that law can be put into, I think it's Appendix 3 of the Basic Law, which meant that Hong Kong could then implement mainland law in Hong Kong with special respects. But since the law has not been fully published, and even if it's not been fully published, everybody else is objecting to it. But according to a senior retired judge in Hong Kong, Henry Litton, who wrote about this,
yes,
if whatever is passed in the law will be subject to Hong Kong court interpretation according to common law principles, and will be decided within the Hong Kong legislature how to handle things like extradition, etc. So it remains how that law is to be implemented.
Absolutely.
But people have said this is the end of Hong Kong. Absolutely. I don't agree. I personally, I think Hong Kong has the ability to reinvent itself. Mm-hmm. It's a very resilient city. I was there during the 1997-98, the attack on the Hong Kong dollar, the Asian crisis, and the ability of Hong Kong to rebound was amazing. And I was there also during the 2003 SARS issue. So I think what is happening in Hong Kong is a political event, I think, or not so much event as the maturing of a society that had 150 over years of British rule, in which no democracy was given. The British never gave Hong Kong Chinese the chance to vote out the British government. And then, of course, famously, they said that China must give it to the Hong Kong people. But that is also, of course, a very difficult conversation between 1.4 billion people and the 7 million people of Hong Kong. So that's the context of the Hong Kong situation.
Yeah.
Right? But the protests that we are now witnessing in America has many parallels with the Hong Kong situation. Maybe you can talk a little bit about that.
Yeah. No, but first, let me put myself out, let me put some, my take, right? Some takes on this and attempt to draw back and look at sort of more fundamental issues behind this. The context in which this is occurring is really important and really interesting to my mind. You mentioned the colonial history, and this. So I want to recommend that we look at three dimensions. One is the Hong Kong crisis in terms of coloniality, right? In the first case. Second, in respect of a type of economic development, liberal order, with which this whole thing has coincided since from 1997 till now. And third, the sort of geopolitics of declining US hegemony, of US empire in East Asia. With respect to the first point on the colonial situation, it's actually a huge part of this, that Hong Kong is the last in a way of the colonies to be liberated, in the modern world, despite being a very developed place financially and so on. It is in that respect politically extremely immature in that regard, right? It went from an out-and-out colony, that is to say a truly anachronistic institution and the last of the British Empire, to being sort of where it is today. The neglect of that perspective, of course, is very much a part of the kind of liberal framing of the Hong Kong issue. So, thumbnail sketch of how it's viewed from the US. You have this narrative of a brutal totalitarian empire, right? On many accounts, you read the New York Times, the most sort of frightening and ominous empire in human history, a total surveillance state, right? They have genocided 1 million Muslims and run concentration camps, right, in Xinjiang. And now it is extending itself to, it is clamping down on Hong Kong. And the protesters are these brave heroes, right? Sort of risking their lives against this, against the machine of Chinese empire. And at the back of this, of course, is Tiananmen, right? So the almost gleeful expectation, right, that the tanks would soon be rolling, okay? And it's a key part of this story, and it's very revealing that the tanks did not roll, right? And as you and I said from the beginning, the tanks are not going to roll. It is not that kind of a state, right? And Hong Kong is not that kind of place. Indeed, actually, and this brings us to the second, another kind of point, another perspective, and that is the perspective of sovereignty and the meaning of one country, two systems. It is precisely because Hong Kong is this very weird space, one country, two systems. It lacks sovereignty. It lacks the ability, right, to actually clamp down on the protests the way the US has done, for example, or is doing. In fact, outside of the media narrative, right, whether it's CNN, New York Times, The Guardian, or whatnot, the striking thing is actually the restraint of the state through 8 months of pretty severe violence. I actually disagree with equivalence between what's happening in what has happened in Hong Kong and the US, right? We'll go to comparisons later, but just to say out here now, Hong Kong has been extraordinarily and systematically violent on the part of a group of protesters, certainly not all of them, but of a influential and important core. And the decision by everybody else that there was to be no criticism, this is a deliberate strategy of this group. While being leaderless, there are certain rules, and one of the chief rules is no criticism of any part of the violence. So it has gone to levels that would never, ever be tolerated in the US. Far away from that, it would have been, anything far less. Within 3 days, we already had this thing being called Antifa terrorists and so on, and the military brought in, something that has not happened in Hong Kong. So we come to this really interesting issue of what kind of space it is and what China is today, actually. It's sort of Hong Kong was handed over, frozen, so to speak, as a colonial entity, right? The Basic Law was an attempt to kind of freeze what works in Hong Kong, a kind of, you know, society, one of the world's, by almost every account, the freest in economic terms, right? The freest society on earth, far more free than the US, but also in civil liberties, right? Heritage Foundation, you name it. Libertarians have always pointed out how free Hong Kong is. So you have this sort of very free society, right? Particularly free for business, and a colonial administration with an executive dominant model, the governor. You hand that over with an attempt to freeze it to another polity, basically from one empire to another, right? So this is not decolonization in the old sense, right? If this was, you know, Indonesia or Malaysia, you decolonize to the people who live there, right? But this is decolonizing to Beijing, so to speak, with Hong Kong kind of retained in that colonial sort of status. And this is not to say that China's rule is illegitimate. It is absolutely sort of legitimate, and it has sovereignty over Hong Kong. But over the years, one of the issues, I don't know if you agree, was that Hong Kong executive and the administration has been described as deeply apolitical, a kind of really apolitical, you know, they're administrators, bureaucrats, right? So they never quite achieved or managed the problem of legitimacy, political legitimacy with the population. And meanwhile, you had this young population, and Hong Kong has gone through actually a deep economic change over this period. I was looking at this from 97 to now. Right before handover, it was just at the last end, the edges of this sort of light manufacturing, right, type of economy with kind of outsourcing to Shenzhen, but there was still a kind of light manufacturing industrial base. As of today, it has taken the path. It is perhaps the purest example of neoliberalization, sort of financialized economy on earth, okay? So and all the contradictions of that system, right? Roaring wealth and increasing concentration of wealth, and the precaritization, if I may, of the people. And in fact, in Hong Kong, absolute poverty on some measures has gone up to 20%, right? While in the mainland, it's the opposite. So if you look at Gini coefficient alone, yeah, mainland inequality may be increasing, but absolute poverty is actually decreasing at a really quick rate, right? So even at the bottom, people are getting better off. And so there isn't that kind of mass sort of disenfranchisement, economic sort of dislocation. Hong Kong is not. Hong Kong more resembles the US in this regard. In fact, a very extreme case. People in the US, if anybody tunes in, have no conception of how sky-high property prices are in Hong Kong. I mean, New York is nothing compared to Hong Kong in terms of scarcity of space and so forth. So that is yet another contradiction in the system. So there was this, you know, Deng Xiaoping and Margaret Thatcher, and it's played as this sort of pragmatic thing where, you know, we hand over, and Deng is supposed to have sort of, in a way, one view is the pragmatic view. We kick the can down the road, right? Let's Hong Kong, you know, we will sort this out. But implicit in that is an understanding of what is unwritten in this, that there's negotiation along the way, negotiation of difference. And the Chinese political system, I want to argue, right, is a way of allowing contradictions and difference, right, to arrive at agreement and to arrive at some sort of unity. So while the sovereignty is unchallenged, it is not, of course, the totalitarian state, right, of the kind of the propaganda machine of the West makes it out to be. So Hong Kong is actually extremely important for China in that regard, because it isn't just, as one thinker said, it isn't just one country, two system. Before the modern era, China was so-called one country, one empire, multiple systems, multiple ways of associating with the center, not one homogeneous state. Indeed, no state of that size has ever, you know, existed in human history. So the Western model of the problem of a kind of a nation state and expecting China to be that, you're not going to get that, right? People like Martin Jakes has observed it's more a civilization than whatever you call it. It is not, it is an unsolved problem in the nature of state here, right? And none of this nuance, none of this emerges in the kind of hysterical anti-China coverage that submerges the Hong Kong issue. Very unfortunately, it's become a football, and its people. And I regret to say, I'm very sad to say, it's almost like there's an entire generation that is indoctrinated in a certain way of thinking about their rights, about their existence, that is irreconcilable, right? Part of that political immaturity is the inability to reconcile. That precisely tells you that there's a kind of deep political immaturity there. And to get to the next part of the conversation, contrast and comparison with the US, it has the opposite relationship with American empire, right? And with white supremacy than the US protesters. US protesters are against white supremacy. The Hong Kong protesters, one might argue, are for the old, for an imperial white-centric order. As the waving of the flags, it is a right-wing movement. This is sad to say. And it's very hard to explain outside of it. How did we end up with a movement that is xenophobic, nativist, right? Which is indeed a right-wing anti-mainland Chinese movement. Whatever the grouses with China, the political orientation is far from being progressive, right? So there's something here that's really rather unfortunate and sort of deplorable in strong tendencies within the Hong Kong protest movement, so much so that I know Hong Kong people, even academics, who are afraid to speak up because they will be targeted, right? So this is an opposite thing to the thing in the US. But the same issue here, as some might put it, is there is an issue of the waning of empire and of a white supremacist empire. Indeed, the racial component, the xenophobic component in Hong Kong is not to be ignored. It's really ugly stuff, and in our normal conversation we don't get to it. But I wanted to sort of put the sort of the fish in the center of the table here.
Right? No, it's very good.
Yeah.
I think you've put it in a historical span of history approach to what's happening in a particular area. Or special administrative zone or region, like Hong Kong, a city, and its role in the world, right? Hong Kong is very special because it's one of the four major international financial hubs, right? New York, London, Hong Kong, and Singapore are four common law financial centers.
Absolutely, yeah.
And it's not only that it's London was the center of the sterling British Empire financial center until America rose to become the dollar hegemonic center, and then but the British were very smart enough to create within its former colonies common law jurisdictions that then became clones of itself, of London, that then intermediated between the new rising powers such as Europe. So the London became the major financial center for the euro-dollar transaction. And then, of course, using Hong Kong and Singapore became the transaction centers for yen, for renminbi, etc. So, it networked 24 hours times 7 global financial centers, of which Hong Kong became a very, very important center because of the rise of China, right, in the last 40 years to become the second largest economy in the world. So the posing of the whole question as a part of a geopolitical, the world has, through globalization, is now one world. But the ideologies have now become, it's moved from one world, a multilateral world, to a multipolar world. Okay, and that shift then requires every city, city-states like Singapore, because it's a sovereign state, then is able to configure itself. How does it operate in that manner? And you put it very, very well. The Hong Kong administration, being administrators, does not have a sovereign type mindset, which enables it to engage its role in the future, right? So Hong Kong got stuck in a time capsule, saying that one country, two systems will be 50 years the same forever. But in that even 20 years, China has emerged as the number 2 country in the world, world's largest trading partner, and then Hong Kong at the 1997 was just under 20% of Chinese GDP, and now down to 2%. Okay, so the relative position has changed.
Right.
And that has, of course, a social impact on Hong Kongers who have then a local parochial perspective of their position in a vastly changed world, changed by technology, changed by geopolitical matters, and changed because the domestic governance structure cannot adapt to the inequalities that have emerged through financialization.
Absolutely.
Right? So what is similar between Hong Kong and America is that these protests are leaderless in the sense that there is a bottom-up protest of what they don't like, and it's a rejection of the elites, right? The major part of the political parties in Hong Kong were completely ignored by the protesters to a large extent. Of course, some of them have now, the younger ones have now moved into putting themselves up for election, etc. But by and large, that movement was basically a bottom-up action. And to a large extent, in the American situation, from looking from outside, the struggle is between the two parties, within the two parties, and how will the two parties handle, this bottom-up swelling of sentiment that calls for dramatic change, right? But you strike a note on what I consider to be the major dilemmas of all empires. Empires go through 3 phases. They take it, they make it, and then they fake it. Right? So basically, if you look at the Anglo-Saxon empire building, very much like Rome, Rome went and took Britain, took Gaul, right? Took Egypt, took all the powers and created this Roman Empire. In the same way, the British took India, took Africa, and then took America, and then fought the French, and and then the Americans then fought Britain, and then created and then took it away from the indigenous powers. The same would happen in Canada, in Australia. It's all about taking it, right? That then you become gentrified, and then you say you make it. So you become a industrial power, you become a scientific power. And then, of course, power is relative. As other powers rise, then you begin to fake it. You begin to say, well, I'm still great, I'm still wonderful, I'm still free, etc. But the reality on the ground tells you things are going to be very, very different.
Yeah.
Right?
As you start to lose it, you lose the ability to read what's on the ground.
That's right.
As well.
That's exactly, that is the elite problem, right? The 1% is not, of the people, by the people, for the people. It's 1% for the 1%, for the 1%.
Right. The Washington elite can't even read, can't even keep up with what's happening in the US, let alone in Hong Kong, which is actually none of their business. But they can't. The Democratic and Republican elite, right, are far behind the curve on these George Floyd
I would put
protests.
it that the global elite And this is what financialization has caused. And I would recommend you read Julia Cage, the wife of Thomas Piketty, who's written a wonderful book called The Price of Democracy, which I'm reading right now.
Right.
And how, you know, democracy was captured by the buying of votes and buying of the media and the control of the media and changing, and how, you know, to a large extent, the image that everything is free, everything is democratic, is at a huge discord with what has been delivered on the ground, and that groundswell is now global. It's not just happening in America. You can see these protests. It's explained as anti-racism, but to a large extent, it's fomented by this huge inequality that has occurred in both income, wealth, and economic opportunity.
Right.
So
in the US, the movement is connected with race. The movement, right? There is the possibility, I think that there's the beginning of an insight that it's not just racism. There's an economic dimension to this, indeed innate to this. It's racial capitalism, and that this racism arose in a particular type of institution, which is colonialism. And in the US, even more brutally, settler colonialism. So there have been there have been empires and there are empires, but there is the empire of the period of the 19th century onwards, right? The sort of the capitalist empires that I'm concerned about here, that have come back into view. Some of the tensions have come back. I think, you know, this period from 1990 up to about now, it's coincided with sort of my it's a large part of my life, right? And I have myself been a part of this. I was educated into it, right? My degree in economics, for example, we were taught a particular kind of economics, right? That turned out to be this sort of imaginary, of course it was an imaginary world, but it was justified as somehow coming into contact with. We both kind of have been interested in this issue of methodology of economics, but there was a huge amount of just ideology in it. Right? We were describing what capitalists wanted to say they were doing rather than what was actually happening. So a massive hypocrisy was always involved in this. It's just that why was that hypocrisy not visible then, and why is everything becoming visible now? We have spoken about this particular time with COVID, for example, with the pandemic, as a time of a kind of apocalypse, in the sense of a kind of revealing, right? A sort of revolutionary moment in that sense. There are certain junctures in history where, you know, the order of things reveals itself in a particularly kind of tangible way, right? And people sense a kind of change. There's a tremendous loss of legitimacy, and it's really hard to keep up with, right? I think we're all exhausted trying to figure out what's going on, but it's important to note that I think it's an epistemological challenge in that we were trained to view the world with a particular set of instruments, in particular, a very ahistorical, apolitical way of viewing it. Right? Intellectually, you know, I would be the first to say, you know, I was like Hong Kong, right? I look at things in terms of technical efficiency, getting stuff done, right? You know, forget about history, forget about the historical context, right? And the imperial context, but it's all there. It's coming back, and it's, you know, hitting us in the face. So at this particular point, my own view is that we need to get a grasp of some of these things, and particularly looking at it from Asia, as Asian people, right? Learning to have our own perspective, coming to have the confidence to have to arrive at a perspective on the world that isn't just this narrative being thrown at us, because it's absolutely ridiculous now. It's really an insult. It's offensive to ask me to believe, for example, right? In the US, for example, if I'm to believe not just the crazies, right? Not just what Trump and Pompeo come out with, but the liberal establishment believes, oh, you know, China deliberately spread this virus. It originated in a lab in Wuhan, right? They have plans now to subvert the West. This is hysterical stuff, right? It's part of what Richard Hofstadter called the paranoid style in American politics, right? Except that it has a global media power behind it. And I always love it when I speak with especially Malaysians and Southeast Asians who've been through the Asian financial crisis. They know, I mean, you were right in the heart of it. Who am I speaking with here? But that we needed to have our own intellectual tools, our own sense of who we were to get at these issues, or we were going to be written into somebody else's narrative. So I feel the importance of this. Right.
Well, this is exactly what the Georgetown conversation is all about.
Yes, yes. That's why I'm so excited about. Yeah.
We really need a conversations of who we are.
Who we are.
This phase of history,
yes,
in which it's a unique phase of history, right?
Yes.
In my view, right? Well, we've seen this through in history, that the old empire is going, and the new order has not been formed.
The new order is not.
And nobody knows what the new order will be.
Yeah.
Right. There is a European view, which is that everything will be done through the rule of law. Right. There is the American order, which will make America great again.
Yeah.
Then there's the Chinese view, which is not necessarily accepted by a lot of people, but it is a system that has survived for quite a few thousand years. And then there is a Russian view. There is an Arabic view, or multiple Arabic views, Middle East views, right? Islamic view. There is an African view. There is a Latin American view, right? All these now require a conversation that has not yet explained itself very well.
Absolutely.
And that's, so it's all about climate change, it's all about technology, it's about demographics, it's about geopolitics, it's about local politics, it's about culture, religion, and now race, right?
Right.
All these make these conversations, in my view, very important, because if we don't talk about it, we'll all explode. I mean, that's exactly what the protest is all about, right? People feel angry, people feel neglected, people feel that they have no voice. But how do we have an orderly voice without violence is really the challenge of this coming century.
Right. So with the breakup of a certain view of the world, right? What I want to say is that with the breakup of a certain order, let us call it the American order, for example, in East Asia, there's also the breakup of the intellectual framework of this.
That's right. That's right.
And if we simply repeat the tired old stuff from this, we are the most pathetic, actually. Right? It's a failure to overcome that condition, because nobody, I think not even in the West do they believe this. You look at the sympathetic protests around the world to the George Floyd protests, right? Nothing, for example, in Hong Kong, actually, Hong Kong over all these have never kind of had that, inspired that kind of solidarity. Was it just because of George Floyd? There is a rejection of something here.
That's right.
Right? And we need to be a little bit ahead and read this. Now, Southeast Asians, East Asians are at least on with respect to two crises, both the global financial crisis and with respect to COVID, we had a head start, both in the Asian financial crisis and in SARS. Things have been, and also in the so-called dealing with the rise of China, all these were, in my working experience, much more real to us than, at least a decade ahead of this thing sinking into the metropoles in Washington and London. Washington is panicking because they've just realized what we kind of already knew maybe in 2000, actually, 2003, right? About China. Of course, we're much closer to that point historically and by kinship and so on. But that we can't afford to be the ones that figure this out last, Each of these intellectual regimes corresponded, these are real issues, there's nothing recondite about them. Each of these corresponded with certain conceptions of world order, which was sometimes realized. There was a Sinocentric, whatever you call it, East Asian order, right? That persisted for about 1,000 years right? Included China, the Ryukyus, Vietnam, right? Korea, Japan, outwards, what is today Myanmar and so on. It was a far, far more peaceful order than the post-Westphalian European one, okay? Which is indeed sort of the most brutal and expansive order in human history. There's no question of that, right? What has been sold to us and told to us, right, say liberal order, sort of benevolent, hegemony of the US. You speak to people and you sit there and you politely smile while they tell you about sort of benevolent hegemony. And you have to sort of try to not bring up in your mind, right, 1966 and the CIA abetted assassination of close to 1 million people, right? And you have to forget about Vietnam. You have to forget about all these things because you're sort of, you have to parrot the ideology, and it suits one's interest and survival to do so. Well, actually, we're freed from that right now, and we need to grasp this moment.
Yeah,
that's
right.
My sense of things.
I think that's where the conversation will continue.
Yes.
It's been fabulous, John. We will carry on this conversation. But thank you very much indeed.